I do believe Alberta is going to successfully separate. I think we'll be out of Canada before the end of 2026. That compounding effect of removing the debasement from our purchasing power will allow entrepreneurs in Alberta to reinvest in their businesses. The growth on that is going to be insane. It's going to be parabolic. The day that the US dollar dies, it'll be over the course of a weekend. It won't be something that you'll be able to be ready for. The most significant destruction of purchasing power the world has ever seen. If we were to look 10, 15 years down the road, instead of having 300 countries, we're probably going to have 5,000 countries, because either they're going to have to start spending a lot less money, start bringing in a lot more money, or keep printing money. I don't see the first two things as being likely at all. They're going to be printing money, and that only leads in one direction.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Dave Bradley to the podcast. Dave is an entrepreneur in Canada and founder of the first physical Bitcoin store in 2013, co-founder of Bull Bitcoin, board member, and living in Alberta. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Age, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you again. So for some of my audience who don't know you, you've been working in the Bitcoin industry since 2013. Tell us a little bit about what helped you see the benefits of Bitcoin so early and some of the lessons you've learned.
Yeah, I mean, I got into Bitcoin as a way to make some quick money, like a lot of people. I didn't really know anything about the concept of hard money. I didn't really think it was going to be this world-changing phenomenon. And I think that's true for a lot of people. They get in, seeing the price increase and they say, I would like to have more dollars. What you really want is more spending power, not more dollars. And it probably took me about 5 years to realize that. It wasn't until many years later that we started to get books like the Bitcoin Standard that so eloquently explain what problem Bitcoin is actually fixing. So I think the discourse and the general knowledge around the topic is much greater than it used to be. When I first got into Bitcoin back in 2010, it was mostly discussed as a kind of a competitor to Visa or MasterCard. It was like a payment tool. And it wasn't until many years later that I heard people discussing the fact that, it was actually going to solve the problem of this massive government overreach that we've all been experiencing.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. How does Bitcoin start to fix incentives?
Well, right now, the problem with incentives is that you don't have the full purchasing power of the money that you spend. So when you make a decision that is supposed to come with all of the incentives that you have when you make a purchasing decision. So I use the example of a dishwasher all the time. If you want to buy a dishwasher, it's because you want clean dishes, but you don't have the full purchasing power of your dollars because the government has printed a lot of other dollars into existence. And so the government's incentives start to come into play with something like a dishwasher, and the government wants your dishwasher to use less power and less water, which those are actually things that are really useful for washing dishes. And so you have two crossed incentives there. And really what Bitcoin does is it removes the government's ability to twist all of these incentives, and it brings all of our incentives right back to the point of the purchase, so that your incentives will be, we always hear like speak with your dollars, right? And you can only really kind of do that right now. But in a future world on a Bitcoin standard where 100% of the purchasing power of the dollars that you earn goes to the decisions that you make, the incentive will be for dishwasher manufacturers to prioritize washing dishes over government ratings agencies and seals of approval and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So you've said that, you've said that Bitcoin fixes everything, and including housing. Tell us about a few of the things that Bitcoin fixes.
Yeah, I mean, you can come up with just about anything. Housing is a good example. Basically, anywhere that your incentives are not fully speaking because you're not getting the totality of the purchasing power that you earned, your incentives are at least being watered down, right? And what ends up happening in a lot of scenarios, like I described with the dishwasher, is that not only are you not getting your incentives, the government is taking the money that they've stolen by printing and actively working against the initial incentives. And so when you break things down to the level of what are the basic incentives for everyone involved, you start to see that it's pretty clear that as we remove their ability to create money out of thin air, we remove their ability to distort our incentive.
Do you think people in government go in knowing this, or they get there and they figure it out and it's too good to step away from?
Um, I think most people, not just those in government, don't really have a firm understanding of how money works. And so there's this kind of broad concept of the greater good where, a lot of people believe that it's right to give to the poor. It's right to give to those who are less fortunate. But what's built into that is the assumption that it's right for a special group of people to use the threat of violence to confiscate resources from the haves, those most useful people in society who earn a living with their time, and redistribute those resources how they see fit. And so there's two huge problems with that. One is that, the government is very bad at everything, right? And so inevitably, when they confiscate resources, they end up redistributing them in a way that is beneficial to them or their friends. And the problems that the so-called we, people always say we should do something about this, and the problems that we were supposed to solve potentially go ignored because the government is spending it on their green slush fund or whatever the latest scam of the day is, right? And so even if the government had its own money, it wouldn't be able to spend things. It wouldn't be able to spend that money any better because there's no incentive for the people who are spending the money to spend it on things that actually help the problems that they are pretending to try to solve, right? There's no consequences if they do this poorly. And if there were consequences for doing it poorly, they'd all have suffered all of those consequences by now because literally every single program that every single government in the history of the world has operated has gone very poorly. And so we know that they're bad at spending our money, but even if they were good at it, there's a moral question at the start of this argument where it's like, does anybody have the right to take my resources and reallocate them without my permission? And I would say no. I was asked recently what my definition of the word evil was, and the best thing that I could come up with was to take without consent. And you take somebody's life, you take somebody's property, you take somebody's time, you do those things without their consent. All of those things are evil. And so at the end of the day, this supposed philanthropy that is forced upon the population is not only wasteful but evil. And I believe that if we were in a world where the incentives were properly aligned and we had a capitalist society and entrepreneurs were able to keep their own resources and grow on them and realize the benefits of how that compounds, that we would have a lot more of those problems that we see in society would be solved by private individuals who, by the way, would have a lot more money to solve those things because the moochers and the leechers at the government wouldn't be there wasting it and spending it on the massive mountains of bureaucracy and all their pet projects.
Yeah. The last time you were on the show, you were saying that the Trump administration would probably help certain things along, but ultimately they're not going to be able to help the debt-based system and all of the problems that we have with the US government. How do you rate them so far, and what do you see going forward?
Yeah, I mean, they're honestly doing better than I thought they would. They're cutting a lot of stuff. They're getting to the bottom of a lot of this corruption, but there's been no serious attempt to actually abate the rate at which the government is spending money that it doesn't have. That's the part that's really just math, right? Like either they're going to have to start spending a lot less money, start bringing in a lot more money, or keep printing money. And I don't see the first two things as being likely at all. I don't see an 80% cut to all government spending being a very likely scenario. And I also don't see a massive increase in taxes or other revenue streams really being feasible to balance that budget. It's just not a likely scenario. And so unless the government becomes sane and reasonable, they're going to be printing money, and that only leads in one direction. You can only print so much money, and then eventually your currency goes to zero.
The Federal Reserve's not going anywhere.
Yeah, yeah. There's no discussion or willingness to seriously approach the very fundamental problems to this debt-based system. It's more an argument about how they spend the money that they print and steal. And I do appreciate that they're spending the money that they print and steal in ways that are more advantageous to average people and less about just being a profit grab for the pharmaceutical industry, the military industrial complex, and really every other special interest group that's well positioned to benefit from government contracts and government larceny.
Do you still believe that the US dollar will fail within the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the timeline. 10 seems like a good guess to me. Um, I expect the US dollar will outlast all of the other fiat currencies. And I think we're going to see a lot of them failing soon, as soon as this year, probably. And yeah, like I say, unless they suddenly become sane and back that dollar by something solid like gold or Bitcoin, or stop printing and spending so much money, then the ending is inevitable. It's just a matter of what the timeline is.
What about, like you mentioned, putting a strategic Bitcoin reserve there? But that would at least slow it down.
Um, so a strategic Bitcoin reserve, as it's been discussed, it kind of sounds like they're saying is we will keep the Bitcoins that we steal rather than selling them. So it's just a speculative position, and it's quite small in the context of the total size of the United States government and its spending. There hasn't been, as far as I know, any serious discussion about actually backing the dollar with with firm assets like gold or Bitcoin. And they're really just they just don't have enough gold and Bitcoin to do that. And so, unless something drastic changes, we're still on the same path. We're just like slightly diverted by the changes that Trump has brought in.
And do you think that would then lead on to, I've heard you say this, possibly taking back the Bitcoin from companies like MicroStrategy or the ETFs somehow? Is that what you see
Yeah, I
happen?
think that's kind of a logical conclusion because there's kind of two things that a government needs to be able to maintain its power. They need an, a military or police force, like an agent of force, and then they need a way to pay that agent of force. And right now they can pay their police and military because the dollar is quite strong. It's the global reserve currency. They can print as much as they want. And so really their ability to exact violence on the world is virtually unlimited at this point. And so, they've got a lot of runway there. But as we've seen in other countries, eventually when the dollar or the bolivar, for example, in Venezuela was printed into oblivion to such an extent that the Venezuelan military would no longer accept bolivars. And they had to basically pick a harder form of money and start paying the military in that. And in that case, it was the US dollar. But in the scenario that I'm describing, where the U.S. dollar becomes printed into hyperinflation mode, and the police and the military, the thugs that allow the government to maintain its monopoly on violence, will no longer accept U.S. dollars. They're going to want something else. They're going to want gold or they're going to want Bitcoin. And realistically, it's going to be a lot more feasible to pay people in Bitcoin than it would be in gold. And they've already seized all the gold, right? So we don't even know if any of the gold is in Fort Knox at this point. My suspicion is no. We heard from Elon that they were getting ready to audit it, and then lo and behold, nobody mentioned it. So I'm pretty sure they opened the door and they're like, "Oh shit, it's all gone. We better just stop talking about that." But what they do have are a tremendous number of Bitcoin sitting in the custodians in the state of New York. They're sitting in Coinbase, they're sitting in Fidelity. They're all regulated by the state of New York, and they're all certainly within the grasps of the United States government, to the point where if they wanted to issue an executive order, a lot like 6102, which allowed them to confiscate the gold, they could actually seize quite a large number of Bitcoin. There's several million Bitcoin in that reserve there. And I see that as probably being one of the last grasps of this empire as it loses its hold, is that they'll inevitably grab whatever resource that they can, which would be very bad for the people who own those Bitcoin right now, because they'll be receiving an IOU of some kind. Might be denominated in Bitcoin or it might be denominated in dollars, but either way, it will only be as good as the credit of the United States government, which at this point will already be in severe decline. And they will never be able to realize the actual long-term purchasing power of those Bitcoin, because the government will not allow them to. The government will steal that purchasing power and use it for itself. But the good news, if you're not one of the people who gets their Bitcoin stolen by the government, is that they will eventually just sell those Bitcoin and then they'll be all out and then they'll have to go away.
You know, I've spoken to a lot of Bitcoiners now that I've been doing this, and I'd say most people do invest in MicroStrategy and the ETFs. A lot of people have retirement accounts. And this scenario you're suggesting, you do say that we're going to see other currencies fail first. So we'll have that little warning. The US will be the last one, probably. But yeah, most people I don't think are expecting this to happen.
Yeah, and so we always use the saying "gradually then suddenly." I think that's maybe a Hemingway quote, and I think that's very likely what we'll see. The day that the U.S. dollar dies, it'll be over the course of a weekend. It won't be something that you'll be able to be ready for, because once the public and once the market starts to lose faith in the U.S. dollar, it's going to go from whatever it's at to zero in a very short period of time, and that purchasing power will be wiped out. It'll be the most significant destruction of purchasing power the world has ever seen, I suspect.
And you're across the pond in Canada, Alberta. You have been seeking independence at the moment. And this is very much related because you also have suggested to go on a Bitcoin standard. Tell us a little bit about this situation.
Yeah. So I started talking pretty seriously about Alberta independence in 2019 when Justin Trudeau was reelected for the last time. I thought it was a point where um, it was so obvious that they were just looting our country at this point that I lost a lot of faith in Canadians, especially Canadians from Eastern Canada, and their ability to really discern reality. It, and so I started talking about independence pretty seriously, and I got a lot of answers, especially from people that I knew who were integrated into the Fiat system, had good jobs, good companies, had a lot to lose related to the Fiat system. The answer that I mostly got from those people was, well, that'll be nice. That would be nice, but it'll never happen. And slowly that answer has shifted, and I think the Overton window has shifted around this topic to the point where about 2 months ago, I started getting a lot of these same people, some of the same people who told me this back then, talking to me about independence and wondering, like, what do we do? What do we actually do? When it looked like, Pierre Poilievre, who is the conservative leader who was running against Justin Trudeau, when Mark Carney got in there and Donald Trump sort of threw his hat into the election, talking about the 51st state in Canada becoming part of the United States, it really just threw a wrench into the election. And either Pierre Poilievre was either spooked or he was controlled opposition, because he really took his foot off the gas and everyone could see it. Yeah. And so a lot of these people who were generally very established, people with a lot of interest in the Fiat system, have really started to see that there isn't a future that is any good for Alberta in Canada. We have a system in Canada of equalization payments. And so the idea is that the have provinces, as they call them, pay more into the country than the have not provinces. But because we had a similar crisis back in the 90s with Quebec wanting to separate, they've just got such a favorable deal where their major source of resource revenue, which is they have a massive amount of hydropower, is not included in the calculations for what provinces are have provinces and what are the have not provinces. And so the end result, we've got most of the money in the country. We have a massive oil and gas industry here. And so we end up subsidizing really the entire rest of the country, but especially Quebec and those maritime provinces. And so it's gotten to a point where they kind of look at us as their cash cow, I guess, is the best way to put it. And, we're not even really being represented within the country. The elections, both of the last two elections were called. The elections were actually over before the polls had closed in Alberta. And when you look at the way that the seats are distributed, because we've had a lot more growth, because we're the only province that has an actual economy that's not propped up by the government, we've had so many people moving to Alberta from other parts of the country. And now we actually receive a lot fewer representatives in our parliament per capita than any other province. When you look at the Maritimes, it's the opposite that has happened. They actually have lost population. Most of those people have moved here, but they actually have nearly as many representatives as we do, even though we have more than double their population. And so we're in this scenario where we're really facing taxation without representation. And the entire American Revolution was kicked off over like a 3% tax on tea, and we're well past that 3% tax on tea. We're in a place where we're just really being looted. And I did some math um, using ChatGPT, and I'd be happy to share my assumptions if anybody wants to reach out. But I would like to see a more robust study done on this. But what I concluded was that if Alberta were to separate and become an independent nation, the average Albertan would save between $17,000 and $25,000 a year. That's not a small number. That's a massive amount of purchasing power that can go back into the pockets of Albertans. And so where this crosses over with Bitcoin, and why I've been talking about Bitcoin as either strategic reserve for Alberta, or like if I had my way, it would be the actual currency of the new independent nation of Alberta, is because both things are aiming to solve the same thing, which is this massive overreach, massive overspending of the government, printing money, taxing us, taking our resources every way that they can, and then in many cases actually using those resources against us. And so right now we're living in a scenario where, depending on how you measure it, we have like 4 or 5 layers of government above us. And I would like to move. I think we're in a position right now to move down to 2 layers of government. And ultimately, I think we'd be better off with somewhere between 0 and 1 layers of government. But moving to 2 is a lot better than 5, because at least if we were down to just our municipal governments that we have now and our provincial government, which would become the national government, we'd at least have our incentives aligned with our neighbors. We'd still have some collectivism going on, which I don't think would be a good thing, but at least collectivism within the province where people are culturally aligned, where we have the same incentives and want to work in the same industries. We'd be in a much better position. And I think we're pretty well positioned right now to get to that point, because Trump is in office, gives us someone else to negotiate if we need help getting out of the country, and partly because Albertans are just so shocked that the Liberals were reelected. Like, it's just such a tragic and ridiculous situation. And realistically, like, it wouldn't have happened without a fair bit of cheating, and B, a whole lot of people who are basically brainwashed by the mainstream media and just take whatever our national broadcaster says as fact. And so I think, we're most Albertans are in a very different camp. And I think when that election happened, I was actually really pleasantly surprised with the response that I saw here. We've got a huge amount of energy behind the independence movement, and I actually got I got several hundred messages from Bitcoiners, mostly around the country, who want to move to Alberta. And we've actually got some of our biggest and best companies, in some companies that for sure, some really well-known and successful Bitcoin companies, have reached out talking to me about wanting to move their companies from other places in Canada to Alberta, because they see that this Alberta independence movement is finally real, and they see the promise of what a much freer country could be.
That's amazing. And I can see how Bitcoiners would really love that. But I can also see how the rest of Canada is not going to love that. So it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle.
Yeah, they're going to go broke. And that's kind of why I think we have the cards when it comes to negotiating our way out of the country. I think there isn't really a clear legal path. There is something of a legal path that was established on behalf of Quebec when they wanted out of the country, but that was a very different situation, because Quebec is a net drain on the country, whereas we're funding the whole thing. So whereas Quebec has been paid to stay, so it's a really different situation. We could really afford, if we didn't have to pay the massive amount of money that we're paying to the rest of Canada, we could afford to essentially bribe our way out of Confederation. And the one way that I could see it working is, instead of just cutting off the flow of funds that we're currently paying to the rest of Canada to keep them above water, we could cut those off slowly over time, and we could strike a deal with Canada that allows us to leave in a peaceful way, in a friendly way, because that's what I want. I want to be good neighbors to the other places in Canada. I don't want to be in the same country as the people in Quebec, and I don't think they want to be in the same country as me. But I think we would make great neighbors and great trading partners. And I would like to move towards a good relationship with those other provinces, and really build from a situation where we all have an incentive to have strong economic ties with each other as well. So I'm hoping that the fact that we have Donald Trump in power in the United States, if we really needed to, if Canada was telling us that we couldn't separate, we were not allowed to, and giving us a bunch of legal reasons and nonsense like that, our ace in the hole is we can always go down to the United States and negotiate a deal with Donald Trump. And I'm not talking about becoming a 51st state. I don't think there's any appetite for that. But I do think that, we could probably strike a pretty favorable deal where we got a free trade zone and, security guarantees and whatnot in exchange for some favorable terms on the massive amount of oil that we sell, and the even greater amount of oil that we will sell in a free and independent Alberta when we actually have capitalism and independent international investors can have some confidence that they can invest in our oil industry without having the rug pulled out from under them by the federal government.
Do you see more countries and provinces around the world who have a lot of Bitcoiners going for things like this? Or what about a circular economy? Can you start a circular economy in Alberta?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty decent but small circular economy here centered around the SAT market that Ben BTC Sessions set up. We do that right before we've got the next one's June 27th. It's right before our conference we're putting on here, the Bitcoin Rodeo, which is on the 28th and 29th here in Calgary. So we do have the start of a circular economy, and mostly what I see at those events is the different vendors buying stuff off of each other, and all the Bitcoiners showing up and buying stuff. It's just like they're pretty small now in comparison to like a regular farmer's market even. But the fact that the options are there and that there are viable ways, like I can buy a cow, I can buy steaks or an entire cow without the government's help or permission using Bitcoin. And that's a very important fundamental base layer to a circular economy. The fact is that right now, like as a payment tool, Bitcoin's just worse than most of our North American payment tools. You go to tap your phone, pay for your groceries. It's a really good experience. And until we get to a point where we just don't have these filthy Canuck bucks in our wallets, why would you spend your Bitcoin when you can spend the money that's losing its value, right? So I think we're at an appropriate spot for the circular economy. It's there, it's growing. And when we really need it, it's going to take off in an explosion, I'm sure. But at this point, it's more of like a novelty and a community builder than anything else, which are both solid things. And back to the start of the question, yeah, I absolutely see there being a lot more countries a lot more regions of the world that will separate. There are regions all over the world that have been wanting separation for a long time. And I think this change that Bitcoin is bringing to the world, wherein it's going to ultimately make it much harder for governments to continue to fund their excesses through money printing, will eventually lead to the collapse of many of the large-scale nation states. This is a central thesis to The Sovereign Individual, which everyone needs to read. And I very much believe that. I think that if we were to look 10, 15 years down the road, instead of having 300 countries, we're probably going to have 5,000 countries. Because once it kicks off, like to give you an example here, I do believe Alberta is going to successfully separate. I think we'll be out of Canada before the end of 2026. That's my like finger in the air prediction. And those things are very rarely wrong for me. The fallout effect from that is going to be significant because right now, as I mentioned earlier, Quebec is paid to stay in the country and they will no longer be paid to stay in the country. The amount they will get paid when you equalize all the provinces without Alberta is going to be minuscule, if anything. They may even end up having to pay the Maritimes to stay in the country. And so I think that's going to very quickly lead to a resurgence in the Quebec separatism. They've got a very distinct and unique culture compared to the rest of Canada, and they do feel like they're a separate nation to Canada. And so I think they'll separate quite easily at that point. And then it's just kind of a domino effect where one province after another is going to start seeing the province right next to us, Saskatchewan, that's very similar to us in a lot of ways. Western culture, oil and gas, a lot of rural people, pretty down to earth. They're gonna see the success that we have, and they're gonna follow ship. It's going to be one after the other. Canada, I expect, will be one of the first to break up like that, but I think it's going to be a blueprint for independence movements all over the world and peoples who want to achieve sovereignty from these large-scale central governments, and not just sovereignty from these large-scale central governments, but sovereignty from the layer of globalists that have their hooks into all of these central governments. The Davos WEF, City of London, all these people who are sort of the overarching power behind the scenes to all this stuff, who have been ultimately the kings of the moochers and the leechers, those who've been siphoning off the most wealth. I think more and more places in the world are getting to the point where they realize that we just don't need those people.
Don't you think they are going to fight it? Or do you think it'll start small, provinces like Alberta will move on?
So they're definitely going to fight it. They already are fighting it quite significantly. One thing that we have really to our advantage in Canada that I think goes really underappreciated is that we have one of, if maybe not the dumbest government in the history of the world. And so when these absolute morons attempt to step on our necks, which is really what they want to do, they're just very bad at it, like they are at everything else. And so if the government was competent, we'd be screwed. But luckily, the government and the existence of the government sort of self-selects for people who want an easy time, people who want to get free money to coast through life without really accomplishing anything. And so those moochers and the leechers are not the ones that we really need to worry about from a strategic perspective. There are villains out there, the sort of like tropey ivory tower evil in, those people do exist, and they're for sure plotting against us. They're probably plotting to kill us in reality, but I don't think they're really in touch with the world as much as they used to be. I think for most of my life anyway, when I look back, these forces were very good at knowing how far they could push. And they've taken an inch, they've taken an inch, they've taken an inch a million times. And for one thing, it's getting to the point where they've taken almost all the resources of the entire world. They're confiscating most of the resources that we generate in North America at this point. But I also think they've kind of lost touch, and they've lost touch with where the line is and how much people will put up with. And I think, interestingly, the first piece that I noticed of that happening was the paper straws. It was very suspicious to me that this 5-year-old video of a turtle stuck up its nose with the straw stuck up its nose suddenly goes viral, and then within 2 weeks, every bar and restaurant in the world had a supply of paper straws. So to me, it feels like it was a deliberate attempt to, I think, test us and see how much bullshit people would be willing to suffer in the name of virtue signaling. Because most everyone has used paper and straws. And if you've used both of those things, you know that you can't make a straw out of paper, right? It's obvious. And yet going in like late 2019, we started to go through that era where, we're trying out the paper straws, and you're basically just like sucking on this wet noodle of gross dissolving paper, leaching bleach into whatever you're drinking. And, I think they didn't realize that they had actually pushed too far with that one. But they took it as a signal, the fact that we were all putting up with it, as a signal to do their next thing, which was COVID, obviously. And so COVID was a massive overreach of their powers, and it was in some ways an attempt to test and flex those powers. But the consequence was that it woke up a lot of people. I think the number of people who were actually aware of what a threat the government is to us was very, very low pre-COVID. It was probably single digits in terms of a percentage. And my educated guess is that COVID woke up something like 30% of the population, at least in North America, and has woken us up to this idea that these people are not our friends. We don't need them, and we shouldn't be paying them. We shouldn't be listening to them. And that group has only been growing since then, because these globalist elites, they're so far out of touch. They're so arrogant. They really just believe their own nonsense to such an extent, and you can see it all over their smug faces. You know what I mean? And they're they're losing the plot at this point. We just saw that whole mini controversy with all the leaders of Europe and the bag of cocaine, and like this is who these people are, right? We're seeing a bunch of drug-addled, mediocre psychopaths really circling the drain. And I hope that the Overton window has shifted enough. I feel like it's shifted enough here for us to achieve our independence. And I hope that it's shifting everywhere. And I believe we're going to start seeing these kind of movements to move away from government control all over the world. And Bitcoin is going to be a natural fit with all of those people, because Bitcoin is definitely the most significant tool that we've ever had to remove government control over our lives.
Yeah. I I see that a lot more people see the problem, and now we need more people to see the solution. Tell us a little bit about how Bitcoin would fix a place like Alberta.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll start with a little bit of a story here. I was at an event on the weekend called the Cornerstone Forum in Alberta, put on by a guy named Sean Newman, who's a great podcaster here in Alberta. And it was a sold out event, about 600 people. And it was planned about a year ago as just kind of like a general freedom event. But because of the fact that we just had the election and it went really poorly for us here in Alberta, this became virtually entirely an independence event. And it was really cool to see the energy in that place. It was really cool to see how positive everyone is feeling about this idea of independence. And there was three different Bitcoin companies there in the trade show area. So and they were all busy. So it's getting to a point for sure where, we as Bitcoiners are getting into these crowds and people are starting to realize what Bitcoin can do. And there's a lot of stuff Bitcoin can do for Alberta as a province, but more importantly, there's a lot that Bitcoin can do for the individuals in the province of Alberta, right? And so the province of Alberta can and should start holding Bitcoin as soon as possible. They can put that on the balance sheet. There's some movement here in Alberta to get that going. I think it has some legs. I'm hopeful that the province of Alberta will start holding a large amount of Bitcoin. Ultimately, even if we don't achieve independence, although I do believe that we will, having a large stockpile of Bitcoin is money that the federal government can't touch, it can't steal, and it can't debase, it can't inflate the value away and spend the value of our savings. And so it can help the province like that, but I think it's much more relevant that it can help the individual like that, because you know the individual loses their purchasing power. Not only do they lose the ability to speak with their dollars to pursue their own incentives, but there's a compounding effect. It's just like we're always taught the magic of compound interest. You make 6% for 18 years, you got $1 million. Or if you take $1 and you double it 20 times, you got $1 million. But if you tax that, you will never get to $1 million, right? You tax it at our regular tax rate and you double it 20 times, you're going to have $20,000 instead of $1 million. And so that compounding effect of removing the debasement from our purchasing power will allow entrepreneurs in Alberta to reinvest in their businesses. The growth on that, as compared to the current system, which is generally significantly stifled by that government confiscation, the growth on that is going to be insane. It's going to be parabolic. And so we're positioned in a spot where it's best for all Albertans to get as many of us as possible onto the Bitcoin standard and using Bitcoin to keep our savings away from the hands of the moochers and the leechers in Ottawa, and grow our economy here, grow our businesses, and grow our province, and do that with the things that are in line with our values, which is individualism, self-sufficiency, and freedom. And Bitcoiners are obviously very aligned with those values. And so I think that Alberta is going to be a natural destination for Bitcoiners, and a natural place where we see a lot of uptick from Albertans becoming Bitcoiners.
That gives me a lot of hope because I've spoken to Jeff Booth and others who say that Bitcoin must become a medium of exchange to succeed as a store of value in the long run. And he believes it will. But that gives me a lot of hope because most of us in the West mostly use it as a store of value. I am starting to spend and replace wherever I can to help the network. Do you also agree with that?
Yeah, and I do that a fair bit. I have most of my money in Bitcoin, and I get paid partially in Bitcoin, so I'm pocketing more Bitcoin than I'm spending these days. I'm still buying, been buying for a while now, but yeah, I definitely believe it's a good idea to be pushing towards that medium of exchange, and setting up those communities are very useful and beneficial to all the people involved. But I'm not worried about that transition at all. I don't think there's a chance that Bitcoin will fail at becoming a medium of exchange. And I think that the most important part are the other two pieces: the store of value and the unit of account, right? And really, we won't get to a unit of account while the dollar is still a functioning unit of account, because it's too hard to move everyone at once, right? And so, like I said before, with the gradually then suddenly, at a certain point, the dollar will become an unusably poor unit of account, because just like we've seen in other countries, you will lose such a large amount of your value in such a short period of time that you won't really be able to use the dollar as this like this thing to compare everything against, right? It can no longer be the denominator in all of our transactions. And at a certain point, everyone's going to have to switch over to Bitcoin. And I think it'll be quite quickly. And at that point, once people are already storing their value in Bitcoin and things are being priced in Bitcoin, it really opens the door for the medium of exchange stuff. And there's a whole bunch of ways that that can be implemented, right? It doesn't really matter if everyone in the world is using on-chain Bitcoin. There's a whole bunch of different solutions on top of Bitcoin that can scale to become the medium of exchange, whether it's the Lightning Network, Liquid Network, or even centralized systems. If we had a system where we were mostly using Visa and MasterCard, and it worked exactly the way that it does now, but instead of transferring dollars, you were transferring Bitcoin, that'd be a really good system in terms of a medium of exchange. And as long as at the end of the day, the users have the option to hold their Bitcoin on chain in their own custody, then I think that those kind of compromises and using custodial services for their efficiency in the short term will realistically be just fine.
So, is there anything you would say to your younger self and other Bitcoiners out there, other than to buy more Bitcoin, but just something that you would have done differently?
Yeah. Well, everybody gives the advice of buy more Bitcoin, which is pretty obvious, but the harder thing to do is sell less Bitcoin. It's very easy to see the spending power that you've accumulated on paper and want to bump up your lifestyle, buy that new car, whatever it is. And I've gone down that path, and I have a lot more Bitcoin if I didn't spend any over those years, right? And so that's probably the single biggest advice that I would give. But I think broadly speaking, there is a conversation that's going to start everywhere in the world in the next 10 years. And that is about, wherever you are, does that need to be a part of what country you're in? Does Texas need to be part of the US? Does Scotland need to be part of the UK? You know what I mean? All of these regions that potentially would be separatist, I think the energy is going to be there, and the performance of these central governments is not going to get it's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. And I think that's the inevitable outcome for a lot of these regions, is that the obvious ones will all start seeking independence sooner rather than later. But we're also going to start to see a lot of places in the world that might never have otherwise had an independence movement, once they start seeing the success of many other small provinces and states around the world becoming independent and getting out from under the shackles of these globalists. It's an idea that I think is just going to spread. So I would say wherever you are, start thinking about what your place might look like as an independent nation. And if you live in a place that is full of communists, move, because it's not going to go well as an independent nation. And we, in places like Alberta, where we value freedom, are much better aligned with the values of Bitcoiners. And so we would love to have all of the Bitcoiners in the world move to Alberta. I think we're going to experience a real rush of a lot of the most useful people in the world moving to the freer jurisdictions in the world, because their rights as an individual will be better respected.
It's a little cold up there, but other than that, it's a great place. Do you think that there needs to be a mindset shift? And do you think it also then is a spiritual shift, because life gets better once this happens?
Yeah, I think there is both a mindset shift, and it ties into that spirituality. At the end of the day, the values that we as Bitcoiners tend to hold, of freedom, self sufficiency, taking responsibility for your actions, those kinds of things have significant consequences when you concentrate enough people believing and acting that way in a society. And so I think we're going to see a lot of improvement to the general fabric of society. And obviously, with harder money comes a lower time preference. So people start making long term choices more often. And I think and hope there will be a lot less people relying on this sort of short term hyper consumption mindset that we have in a lot of the Western world these days. And I think that, a lot of people will sort of start to have to look at themselves and the value that they provide to the world. And those who are currently in jobs like the government or the lube industry, which is what I call the mountain of lawyers and consultants and accountants that all they really do is make it so it doesn't hurt as bad when the government fucks you, um, those people are not going to be needed in their current roles. They're going to have to find something useful to do, and that itself is going to bring about a great shift in society. A much greater percentage of people in society will be in jobs that are actually producing something rather than just organizing things for the people who are producing something. And I think that is going to be a major shift that benefits all of us, because on average, we'll just be producing more stuff and there will be more wealth to go around.
For our last question, are you going to into politics, Dave?
Nope. No, I've actually had a bunch of people ask me that. I have no interest in running for politics, in getting into that stupid machine. I might someday lead a mob with pitchforks and torches, but that would be the extent of my political aspirations.
Well, you've got a lot of great Canadian Bitcoiners up there. So I hope you all get together and make change.
We're doing it.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.